There is a particular quality to the light at the end of a long war. It falls differently than it did before, softer in some places, heavier in others, as though the air itself has grown tired and needs a moment to rest before deciding what kind of day it wishes to be. In the years just after 1945, that light fell across a world that had been rearranged, quietly and irrevocably, by nearly 6 years of conflict so vast and so consuming that even the places untouched by flame carried some trace of its warmth upon them. The world was still, or it appeared to be still. Beneath the surface of that stillness, the way water moves slowly and darkly beneath a frozen lake in the deep of winter, something new was already beginning to take shape. It is useful, perhaps, to imagine the world in those first years after the Second World War as something like a very large and very old house after a storm. The storm has passed. The shutters are no longer banging. The wind has gone somewhere else, somewhere distant and irrelevant, and the people inside the house are walking slowly from room to room, assessing what has been damaged, deciding what can be repaired, and what must simply be left as it is, a reminder of the weather that came before. The house is enormous. Its corridors are long and dimly lit, and in two of its largest rooms, on opposite ends of the house, two very different kinds of people have begun to settle in, and they are not entirely certain how they feel about one another. The United States had emerged from the Second World War in a condition that was, by historical standards, quite unusual. Its territory had not been invaded. Its cities had not been bombed into rubble and dust. Its factories, which had been producing ships and aircraft and weapons in quantities that once seemed almost impossible, were still standing, still humming gently, still producing. The country was tired, in the way that anyone is tired after a long and demanding effort, but it was also prosperous in a way that felt new and a little unfamiliar, like a coat that fits well but has not yet been worn enough to feel truly comfortable. American soldiers came home to streets that were intact, to houses that still had their windows, to a country that smelled of grass and gasoline, and the particular warm sweetness of things returning slowly to normal. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had endured losses so large that they are difficult to hold in the mind for very long. Something in the neighborhood of 27 million Soviet citizens had died in the course of the war, a number so immense that it drifts past ordinary comprehension the way a very large landscape drifts past the window of a slow-moving train. You can see its general shape, its broad and blurring outlines, but you cannot quite take in all of its details at once. Entire cities had been leveled. Entire regions had been transformed into something resembling the surface of the moon, pale, cratered, emptied of the ordinary textures and sounds of life. The Ukrainian countryside, the Russian steppe, the forests of Belarus, all of them bore the marks of armies that had moved back and forth across them with the slow, grinding patience of glaciers, leaving behind a landscape that was recognizable only in its most general contours. And yet, even in that condition of exhaustion and enormous loss, the Soviet Union had emerged from the war with something it had not quite possessed before, or had not quite believed it possessed: a sense of its own power. The Red Army, which had begun the war in a state of some disarray, had grown into something vast and methodical and deeply experienced in the particular arts of large-scale warfare across enormous distances. It had pushed westward across Europe with the slow, irresistible momentum of a tide coming in, and it had arrived at last in the rubble of Berlin, which it had reached before the Americans, before the British, before anyone else. There was, in that arrival, a kind of statement, not a loud one, not a triumphant one, but a quiet and steady one, like the sound of a door closing softly in a large and otherwise silent building. The two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, had been allies during the war, in the way that two people who do not particularly like one another will sometimes stand together under the same awning during a rainstorm. The necessity was real, and the cooperation was real enough, but beneath it there had always been a kind of careful watchfulness, a gentle and persistent awareness of difference. The United States was a democracy with a market economy, built on a set of values that placed the individual at the center of things. The individual's rights, the individual's freedoms, the individual's capacity to own property and move about freely and speak without undue consequence. The Soviet Union was something else entirely, a state organized around the collective, around the idea that society as a whole, guided and directed by the Communist Party, was the fundamental unit of meaningful existence. These were not small differences. They were the kind of differences that sit quietly in a room, taking up very little space, barely visible, until the room grows quiet enough that you begin to notice them. The wartime alliance between the two countries had been managed, in large part, by the weight and personality of the leaders involved. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, had approached his Soviet counterpart with a kind of careful optimism, a belief, or at least a hope, that the relationship could be made to work, that the differences could be bridged, that the world after the war might be organized around some kind of shared understanding. Roosevelt died in the spring of 1945, before the war in Europe had ended, in a small house in Georgia where he had gone to rest, sitting for a portrait when the end came quietly and without warning. He was replaced by Harry Truman, a man from Missouri with a more direct and somewhat more skeptical disposition, who had not been fully briefed on all of Roosevelt's conversations and commitments, and who found himself, in the first weeks of his presidency, trying to understand an enormous and complicated inheritance. Joseph Stalin, who led the Soviet Union, was a man of considerable patience and considerable suspicion in roughly equal measure. He had governed the Soviet Union since the late 1920s, through collectivization and famine, and the vast political purges of the 1930s that had swept through the party, and the military like a slow, consuming fire, removing anyone who might conceivably pose a challenge to his authority. He had survived the German invasion of 1941, which had come close, very close, to ending everything, and he had presided over the long, grinding reversal of that invasion, the slow pushing back of German forces across the vast, snowy distances of the Eastern Front. He trusted very few people, and he trusted foreign governments least of all. The Western powers, he believed, had been slow to open a second front in Europe, slow to invade France, slow to draw German forces away from the Soviet Union. And he interpreted that slowness, in the way that deeply suspicious people often interpret the actions of others, as a kind of deliberate calculation, an intention to let the Soviet Union bear the heaviest cost of the war. The conferences at which the post-war world was shaped, Tehran in 1943, Yalta in the cold and somewhat gloomy February of 1945, Potsdam in the dusty warmth of that same year's summer, had the character of very careful, very slow conversations between people who were trying to be polite to one another, while also trying to secure what they each considered essential. At Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had agreed, in broad terms, on the division of a post-war world into spheres of influence, the eastern part of Europe falling under Soviet sway, the western part under American and British influence. The language of these agreements was, in many places, deliberately vague, the kind of language that people use when they want to reach an agreement without quite committing themselves to a specific interpretation of it. That vagueness, which seemed like a convenience in the winter of 1945, would become, in the years that followed, a source of quiet and persistent friction. Germany, the country at the center of everything, was divided into four occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, and its capital, Berlin, which lay deep within the Soviet zone, was itself divided into four corresponding sectors. The city in those early post-war years had the quality of a dream that has not quite decided what kind of dream it wants to be. Its streets were full of rubble that was being slowly, methodically cleared away, brick by brick, in work parties that moved through the gray light of early morning with a patience that seemed almost geological. There were buildings standing beside buildings that had been reduced to their foundations, so that the cityscape had an irregular, jagged quality, like a sentence from which random words have been removed. The air smelled of dust and smoke, and the particular coolness of a city that has lost much of its roof, and is open, in many places, to the sky. The Soviet Union, in the period immediately following the war, moved with quiet deliberateness to consolidate its influence in the countries of Eastern Europe that the Red Army had liberated, or occupied, depending on how one chose to regard the situation during the westward advance. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. In each of these countries, communist parties that had in many cases been small and politically marginal before the war found themselves, in the late 1940s, in positions of increasing authority. The process by which this happened was gradual, in the way that the cooling of a room after the fire has gone out is gradual. You do not notice it happening precisely, but you notice, at some point, that the temperature has changed, and that the change seems to be permanent. In Poland, which had suffered perhaps more than any other country in Europe during the war, losing something close to a fifth of its entire population, a provisional government dominated by communists was installed, despite the existence of a Polish government in exile in London that had represented the country's interests throughout the war. The elections that were eventually held in Poland in 1947 were neither free nor fair in any meaningful sense. The results had been arranged in advance, with the quiet efficiency of someone tidying a room before guests arrive. The story was similar, in its broad outlines, across the rest of Eastern Europe. A slow, methodical replacement of pluralist political arrangements with single-party communist systems, accomplished through a combination of political maneuvering, electoral fraud, and the quiet but ever-present weight of Soviet military power in the background. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who had guided his country through the war with such stubborn and articulate resolution, had been voted out of office in July 1945, while the Potsdam Conference was still underway, a detail that has always seemed, to those who noticed it, like a rather pointed demonstration of democracy's peculiarities. He returned to office later, but in the meantime he had time to observe, from his position outside of government, the way the map of Europe was slowly being redrawn. In March of 1946, at a small college in Fulton, Missouri, he gave a speech in which he described what he saw happening in Europe in language that was memorable in its plainness. An iron curtain, he said, had descended across the continent, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. The phrase was not entirely new. Others had used similar language before him, but in his mouth it had a particular resonance, the quality of a description that fits its subject so precisely that it seems, in retrospect, to have always existed. The phrase Iron Curtain is worth dwelling on, if only for a moment, because it captures something important about the quality of the division that was taking shape in those years. Iron is cold to the touch. It does not conduct warmth particularly well. It is heavy, and it does not move easily, and when it does move, it does so with a kind of slow inevitability rather than a sudden shift. A curtain is something drawn across a space to separate one part of it from another, to keep the light on one side from reaching the other, to keep what is on one side from being seen by the other. The Iron Curtain of Churchill's phrase was not a physical object. Not yet. The physical wall would come later, in Berlin, in 1961. But it described something real and increasingly solid, a boundary between two worlds that were being organized along different principles and were growing, gradually, less and less legible to one another. The United States, in the years immediately following the war, was trying to understand its new position in the world. It had always had, as part of its national self-image, a certain ambivalence about foreign entanglement, a tradition, going back to the earliest days of the Republic, of preferring to tend to its own affairs rather than committing itself to the complicated and often exhausting politics of the Old World. But the war had made that kind of withdrawal difficult to imagine. The United States was now the most economically powerful country on Earth, by a margin that was not even close. It possessed the atomic bomb, which it had used twice, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the burning August of 1945, and whose existence had altered, in some fundamental and not entirely graspable way, the nature of what it meant to be powerful in the world. It had troops stationed across Europe and Asia. It had interests, economic and strategic, that extended to every corner of the globe. The world had come to it, as it were, whether it had wanted the world to come or not. The doctrine that would give shape to American foreign policy for the next 4 decades was articulated, in its first clear form, in a speech delivered by President Truman to Congress in March of 1947. The speech was, in tone, measured and deliberate, the voice of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say and is saying it in the plainest possible language. Truman asked Congress for aid to Greece and Turkey, both of which were facing significant internal pressures, Greece from a communist insurgency, Turkey from Soviet pressure along its borders. But the speech was understood by those who heard it to be saying something larger, that the United States was prepared to support free peoples who were resisting subjugation, wherever they might be. This became known as the Truman Doctrine, and it marked a moment in which American foreign policy stepped, with deliberate slowness, from one position into another, the way someone steps from one large flat stone to another while crossing a shallow stream. A few months later, in June of 1947, the Secretary of State, George Marshall, outlined in a speech at Harvard University a plan for the economic reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan, as it came to be known, would ultimately channel something in the neighborhood of $13 billion, an enormous sum in the currency of that era, into the economies of 16 Western European countries over the following 4 years. The plan was offered, in principle, to the countries of Eastern Europe as well, but the Soviet Union declined the offer and pressured its satellite states to do the same. The reasoning was not difficult to understand. Accepting American money would have meant accepting American conditions, which would have meant allowing the kind of economic openness and transparency that was fundamentally incompatible with the Soviet model. And so the dividing line between the two halves of Europe was drawn a little deeper, a little more firmly, like a line traced not once but twice over the same page. There is something almost meditative about the way the Cold War came into being, the slowness of it, the gradualness of it, the way it assembled itself from 1,000 small decisions and gestures and misreadings and calculations, each one individually rather modest, each one contributing its small weight to a structure that would eventually become very large and very heavy and very difficult to move. It was not declared. There was no moment at which someone stood up and said, "The Cold War has begun." Instead, it arrived the way all large, slow things arrive, not all at once, but in the way that winter arrives, gradually, imperceptibly, through the shortening of days and the cooling of air and the slow disappearance of leaves, until one morning you wake up and the world is white and still, and you understand, without anyone having told you, that something has changed. By 1947 and 1948, the broad shape of the New World was becoming visible. In the West, the United States and its allies were constructing a network of economic and political relationships organized around open markets, democratic governance, and a shared commitment to containing the spread of Soviet influence. In the East, the Soviet Union was tightening its grip on the countries along its western border, building a bloc of states that shared, or were required to share, its political and economic system. The world that had been briefly unified, however imperfectly and however temporarily, by the shared necessity of fighting Nazi Germany was separating again, along lines that were older and deeper than the alliance, lines that had their roots in the different histories and values and self-understandings of the two great powers at its ends. The city of Berlin, sitting in its strange position deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, became, in those years, a place of particular symbolic weight. In June of 1948, the Soviet Union closed the roads, railways, and canals that connected West Berlin to the Western occupation zones, cutting off a city of more than 2 million people from its supply lines. The blockade was a gesture of considerable audacity, a test, perhaps, of Western resolve, a probe to see whether the discomfort of maintaining a Western presence in the middle of Soviet-controlled territory might eventually become too great to bear. The Western response was to supply the city entirely by air, an airlift that, at its height, involved a cargo plane landing at one of West Berlin's airports every few minutes, day and night, carrying coal and food and medicine, and all the other things that a large city needs to sustain itself. The airlift continued for nearly a year, through the autumn and winter and into the spring, a slow and steady and almost rhythmic demonstration of patience. The Soviet Union lifted the blockade in May of 1949, having achieved nothing except, perhaps, a clearer understanding of what the other side was prepared to do. In that same year, 1949, two events occurred that deepened the atmosphere of quiet tension in ways that would not be fully understood for some time. In April, 12 nations, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and 8 others, signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating the alliance that would be known as NATO, a mutual defense pact organized around the principle that an attack on any one member would be treated as an attack on all. And in August, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, in the flat and dusty emptiness of the Kazakh steppe, bringing to an end the brief period in which the United States had been the only country in the world to possess nuclear weapons. The test was detected by American monitoring aircraft, which sampled the air over the Pacific and found in it traces of radioactive material that told a clear and unambiguous story. The world had just become, in a quiet and definitive way, more complicated. In the same year, across the vast distances of China, the long civil war between the nationalist government and the communist forces led by Mao Zedong came to its conclusion. As communist forces moved southward and eastward across the country with the slow, steady, unstoppable quality of a tide, the nationalist government retreated to the island of Taiwan, and in October 1949, the People's Republic of China was declared, adding to the map of communist-governed states a country of nearly 500 million people. In Washington, the question of who had lost China, as though China had been something that could be owned and misplaced, became a source of considerable political anxiety, a question that hung in the air with the quiet persistence of smoke from a fire that has been put out but has not entirely stopped smoldering. All of this happened slowly, in the way that history mostly happens, not in great dramatic leaps, but in the patient accumulation of days and decisions and shifts in the weather of international politics. The people living through it did not, for the most part, experience it as a great unfolding drama. They experienced it as a series of newspaper headlines, of radio broadcasts heard while doing other things, of conversations at kitchen tables and in offices and on park benches, of a gradual and persistent awareness that the world they were living in was not quite the world they had imagined they would live in after the war was over. There was a tiredness to it, a heaviness, like the feeling of carrying something that is not quite heavy enough to put down but not quite light enough to forget you are carrying. The Cold War, as it settled into its first form in those years between 1945 and 1950, was not a war in any conventional sense. No armies faced each other across a defined front. No territory changed hands in the way that territory changes hands in conventional conflicts. Instead, it was something more like a long, quiet argument conducted in a dozen different languages across a dozen different arenas: economic, political, military, cultural, scientific. An argument about which of two visions of human organization was better suited to the needs and capacities of actual human beings. It was an argument that would continue, in one form or another, for more than 4 decades, and it would shape the lives of billions of people who had no direct involvement in it, who simply found themselves living in a world where the two largest and most powerful states on Earth regarded each other with a wariness that never quite dissolved into either genuine friendship or open conflict. And so the world cooled, not all at once and not evenly, but steadily and persistently, the way a room cools after dark when the windows are left open and the last of the day's warmth drifts slowly out through the curtains. The warmth of wartime alliance faded. The easy goodwill of shared victory, never entirely genuine, always a little complicated, gave way to something more guarded, more careful, more aware of the distances involved. Two vast countries settled into positions on opposite ends of the world and looked at each other across the great stillness of an ideological divide, each one certain of its own rightness, each one genuinely uncertain about what the other might do next. And the world, which had been hoping for something simpler and easier after the exhaustion of the war years, found itself instead in the long, slow, complicated twilight of the Cold War, which was neither peace nor war but something partway between, a condition that would persist, with its particular quality of muted tension and careful watchfulness, for a very long time indeed. The dust settled slowly over the ruins of the old world, the light changed, the seasons turned, and the Cold War, which nobody had quite intended and nobody had quite declared, was underway. There is a particular feeling that comes with the building of walls, not the dramatic moment of their completion, but the long, quiet process of their construction, the slow accumulation of brick upon brick, of decision upon decision, of habit upon habit, until one day you look up and find that what was once open space has become something solid and permanent, something that has acquired, through the simple passage of time, the quality of having always been there. The division of the world that the Cold War produced was built like that, not all at once, not with a single decisive gesture, but slowly and methodically, through the patient layering of structures and arrangements and understandings that gradually hardened into something that felt, after a while, like the natural order of things. In the late 1940s and through the long, unhurried years of the 1950s, the architecture of that divided world was assembled piece by piece, the way a very large and complicated building is assembled, with many hands working on many parts simultaneously, the whole taking shape before any single worker has quite understood what it is becoming. It is worth pausing for a moment to think about what the word architecture means in this context, because it is a useful word, a word that carries within it a certain quality of intention and structure, without quite suggesting the drama of conflict. Architecture is about the arrangement of space, about deciding what goes where, about determining the relationship between one part of something and another, about creating forms that can be inhabited and used over long periods of time. The Cold War's architecture was not made of stone or steel or glass, though it did eventually produce some very famous walls and very heavily guarded borders. It was made of treaties and alliances and economic arrangements and political systems, and perhaps most importantly, of the slow, quiet shaping of how ordinary people understood their world and their place within it. It was an architecture of the mind as much as of the earth, and it was built with the same unhurried patience that all enduring structures require. In Western Europe, in the years following the end of the war, the process of rebuilding was underway with a steadiness and a thoroughness that owed a great deal to the flow of American money through the Marshall Plan. The cities that had been damaged, London, with its bombed-out streets and its patient, tired people; Paris, which had been spared the worst of the physical destruction but carried its own weight of complicated memory; the cities of Germany and Italy and the Netherlands and Belgium, which had been rebuilt, street by street from the rubble up, were slowly reassembling themselves into something that felt, tentatively and cautiously, like normalcy. Cafes reopened. Trams ran again. Children went to school in buildings with intact roofs, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from bakeries that had found their footing again after years of scarcity. The Marshall Plan was, on one level, an act of considerable generosity, and on another level an act of considerable strategic intelligence, and these two things were not in contradiction with each other, but simply the expression of a policy that understood something important: that prosperous countries with functioning democracies were less likely to turn to communism than countries that were poor and exhausted and without hope of improvement. The Soviet Union understood this too, and found it irritating in the way that one finds irritating a move in a game that one recognizes as clever but cannot immediately counter. the communist parties of France and Italy, which had emerged from the war with significant popular support, partly because of their prominent role in resistance movements during the German occupation, found that support gradually and quietly eroding as the 1950s progressed, and the standard of living in Western Europe began its long, slow improvement. The organization of Western Europe into a coherent bloc, aligned with American interests, proceeded, through the late 1940s and the 1950s, with the careful patience of people who understood that the structures they were building would need to last. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which came into formal existence in April of 1949, was the military expression of this process, a collective defense arrangement that committed its members to treating an attack on any one of them as an attack on all. The treaty was signed in Washington on a mild spring day, and its signatories understood that they were doing something that the United States had never quite done before in peacetime, committing itself, in advance and in writing, to the defense of other countries. It was a significant departure from the tradition of avoiding entangling alliances, and it was accepted with a certain quiet solemnity, as one accepts a commitment that one knows will be long and demanding, but that one has decided, after careful consideration, is necessary. The Soviet response to the formation of NATO was, for several years, largely rhetorical, protests and denunciations delivered in the measured and somewhat formulaic language of Soviet diplomacy, which had its own particular music, its own cadences of indignation and warning. The more concrete Soviet response came in 1955, when the Warsaw Pact was established, a mutual defense treaty among the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe that mirrored, in its formal structure, the arrangements of NATO on the other side of the divide. By the mid-1950s, Europe was organized into two armed camps, each with its own treaty organization, its own command structures, its own arrangements for the movement of troops and the positioning of weapons, its own quiet and persistent awareness of the other side's capabilities and intentions. But the architecture of division was not built only in the realm of military alliances. It was built also in the realm of economics, in the gradual separation of the Western and Eastern European economies into two distinct and largely non-communicating systems. The Soviet Union organized the economies of its satellite states through a body called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, known by the somewhat ungainly acronym Comecon, which coordinated the production and trade of the Eastern Bloc countries in ways that oriented them toward Moscow and away from the Western markets. Eastern European factories produced goods that were traded within the bloc. Eastern European workers lived in a world of centrally planned economics, of state-owned enterprises, of wages and prices determined not by the movement of markets, but by the decisions of planners sitting in offices in Warsaw and Prague and Budapest and East Berlin, making their slow and careful calculations about what a country needed and how best to provide it. The quality of daily life in Eastern Europe in the 1950s had a texture that was distinct from daily life in Western Europe, and that texture was felt in ways both large and small. There was, in many Eastern European countries, a shortage of consumer goods that was persistent and somewhat resigned to a condition in which things like washing machines and refrigerators and automobiles were not impossible to obtain, but were difficult enough that their acquisition required patience, and sometimes the cultivation of the right connections. Shop windows in East Berlin had a different quality than shop windows in West Berlin. Less abundance, less variety, less of the particular gleam of things being offered for purchase to people who have the means to purchase them. This was not, in the official ideology of the Eastern Bloc, considered a failing. It was rather considered a sign that the economy was oriented toward collective needs rather than individual consumption, toward steel production and infrastructure and defense rather than luxury and excess. But the people who lived within those economies experienced the shortage not as ideology, but as a daily reality, as the small recurring frustration of wanting something and finding it unavailable. In the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, as it was known informally and permanently, the experience of the division was uniquely concentrated and uniquely strange, because the division was not something experienced at a comfortable distance, but something inscribed directly into the landscape, into the cities, into the streets and neighborhoods and family relationships of ordinary people. East Germany shared a border not only with West Germany but, through the peculiar geography of Berlin, with the western sectors of the former German capital, and that border was, in the early and middle years of the 1950s, still permeable enough that people could and did move across it, carefully, with appropriate documentation, but still. Hundreds of thousands of people left East Germany for West Germany in those years, a slow and persistent hemorrhage of population that worried the East German government, and behind the East German government, the Soviet Union, because the people who left tended to be young, educated, professionally skilled, exactly the people whom a developing socialist economy could least afford to lose. The men who governed East Germany in those years, and it was almost always men, had the particular quality of officials who are governing on behalf of someone else's vision, men who have committed themselves to a project that they believe in genuinely enough, but who also understand, at some level, that the foundation of their authority is the presence of Soviet troops and Soviet political support, and that without these things their position would be considerably more fragile than it appears. Walter Ulbricht, who led East Germany through most of its formative years, was a small, precise, somewhat colorless man with a neat beard and a capacity for bureaucratic persistence that was genuinely impressive. He had spent the years of Nazi rule in exile in Moscow, learning the particular arts of Soviet-style communism, and he returned to Germany in 1945, carrying within him a vision of a socialist German state that he would spend the next quarter-century attempting, with varying degrees of success, to construct. The construction of socialism in East Germany proceeded in a manner that was, by the standards of what was happening in neighboring countries, not entirely without accomplishment. The East German economy did grow, particularly in the early years, and the state did provide its citizens with a range of services, housing, education, healthcare, that had not always been available to ordinary Germans before the war. The cities were rebuilt, more slowly than in the West and in a somewhat different aesthetic idiom. A preference for broad avenues and large, symmetrical public buildings over the irregular, organic growth of older European urban forms, but rebuilt nonetheless, until they had an inhabited quality, a functioning quality, even if they lacked the glitter and abundance of their Western counterparts. There was a sameness to much of the architecture of socialist East Germany, a functionalist plainness that had its own kind of austere dignity, like a sentence written without ornament but not without care. Across the border in West Germany, a different kind of reconstruction was underway, and it was proceeding with a speed and a thoroughness that eventually acquired a name: the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Under the leadership of Konrad Adenauer, a former mayor of Cologne who had spent the Nazi years in a quiet and deliberately inconspicuous retirement, West Germany remade itself with remarkable efficiency. The currency reform of 1948, which replaced the debased wartime Reichsmark with the new Deutschmark, created an almost immediate effect. Goods that had been hoarded appeared in shop windows overnight, as though they had been waiting quietly in back rooms for exactly this moment. The Marshall Plan money flowed in. Factories were rebuilt or repurposed. The German capacity for careful, methodical industrial organization, a capacity that had been applied, with terrible results, to the machinery of war, was now applied to the machinery of production, and the results accumulated with the quiet persistence of compound interest. West Germany was admitted to NATO in 1955, an event that would have seemed, a decade earlier, almost inconceivable: the reintegration of a recently defeated and deeply compromised nation into the community of Western allies, as a full and equal partner. It happened, nonetheless, partly because the strategic logic of the Cold War made a rearmed West Germany, oriented firmly westward, more useful than a disarmed and neutral Germany whose orientation might be uncertain. Adenauer himself was a deeply Catholic Rhinelander who had a bone-deep suspicion of Prussia and of whatever lay beyond it to the east, and he embraced the Western alliance with a conviction that was both strategic and temperamental. West Germany, under his guidance, became perhaps the most firmly embedded of all the NATO allies, the country most committed to the Western project, the country whose entire post-war identity was most thoroughly organized around the transatlantic relationship. The division of Germany was not only a political division but a human one, and its human dimension was felt most acutely in the families and friendships that crossed the border. The grandmother in Leipzig, whose grandchildren lived in Hamburg. The brothers separated by the accident of which zone they happened to be living in when the lines hardened. The lovers who had planned a shared future in a city that had been divided before they had quite finished planning. Letters crossed the border, slowly and with some care, because one could not always be certain what the censors on the eastern side might make of this or that phrase, this or that piece of news from the western side. Phone calls were expensive and not always reliable. Visits were possible, under certain conditions, with certain documentation, but they required a kind of bureaucratic patience that not everyone possessed, and that added to every reunion a quality of heaviness. The awareness that the visit would end, that the border would reassert itself, that the reunion was temporary in a way that ordinary visits between relatives in ordinary countries were not. The experience of living in a divided Europe had, for the people on the eastern side of the divide, a quality that is difficult to describe without resorting to a word that is perhaps too large and too dramatic for the ordinary texture of daily life, but that is nonetheless accurate: unfreedom. Not the dramatic, acute unfreedom of a dungeon or a cell, but the chronic, ambient unfreedom of a life lived within a framework that one did not choose and cannot easily alter, the knowledge that one cannot travel freely to certain places, cannot say certain things in certain company, cannot organize politically outside the structures provided by the party, cannot receive certain information or read certain books or watch certain television programs without some degree of risk or inconvenience. This unfreedom was not equally distributed. It varied by country, by period, by the particular character of the regime in power. Poland in 1956 was a different place from Romania in 1956. Czechoslovakia in 1967 was a different place from Czechoslovakia in 1969. But the broad condition of constrained possibility, of a life lived within walls that were sometimes visible and sometimes invisible, but always present, was a common feature of the Eastern Bloc experience. The Soviet Union itself, under Stalin in the late 1940s and early 1950s, had entered one of its most rigidly controlled periods, a time in which the arts and sciences and intellectual life generally were subjected to a careful and somewhat exhausting ideological supervision that went by the name of Zdanovism, after Andrei Zhdanov, the party official most closely associated with it. Writers were expected to produce works that celebrated Soviet achievements and socialist values, in a style known as socialist realism, which privileged clarity and accessibility and optimism, and the depiction of heroic workers and collective farms, and the general forward movement of history toward a communist future. Composers were criticized for producing music that was too dissonant, too Western, too individualistic. Scientists were expected to align their findings with ideological requirements, which produced, in the field of biology, the bizarre episode of Lysenkoism, the promotion, at Soviet state level, of a theory of inheritance that contradicted the established science of genetics, because it was considered more compatible with Marxist-Leninist principles. All of this was taking place against the background of a Soviet state that was still, in many ways, recovering from the enormous trauma of the war and the particular trauma of Stalin's own governance. The purges, the camps, the vast system of forced labor that stretched across the permafrost of Siberia and the frozen distances of the Soviet North, a system known collectively as the Gulag, in which millions of people had lived and worked and died under conditions of extraordinary harshness. The existence of this system was not entirely secret. Even in the West, there were memoirs, there were reports, there were the careful accounts of people who had escaped or been released, but its full scale and its full horror would not be publicly acknowledged within the Soviet Union itself until after Stalin's death, which came in March of 1953 with the quiet inevitability of all things that have been expected but not quite planned for. Stalin died, as the accounts have it, on the floor of his dacha outside Moscow, having suffered a stroke that went untreated for some hours because the people around him were too frightened of his displeasure to enter his room uninvited. There is something almost novelistic about this detail. The most powerful man in the Soviet state lying helpless on the floor while his subordinates waited outside the door, uncertain whether to intrude. He had ruled for a quarter of a century, and his rule had left marks on the Soviet Union and on the wider world that would take decades to assess, and that in some respects are still being assessed. His death left a vacuum that took years to fill, and in the meantime the Soviet Union entered a period of collective leadership that had a somewhat tentative quality, like a house whose principal occupant has recently departed and whose remaining inhabitants have not yet quite decided how to arrange the furniture. The man who eventually emerged as the dominant figure in post-Stalin Soviet politics was Nikita Khrushchev, a Ukrainian-born party official who had the broad, bluff, physical quality of someone who has spent time doing actual work with his hands, and who combined a genuine belief in the possibilities of socialism with a temperamental directness that distinguished him sharply from the careful, opaque manner of his predecessor. Khrushchev's most dramatic early act was a speech he delivered to the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in February 1956. a closed session, not intended for public dissemination, in which he described in remarkable detail the crimes of the Stalin years, the purges, the terror, the cult of personality, the arbitrary cruelty of a system that had consumed millions of people without cause or justification. The speech was, by the standards of Soviet political culture, an astonishing document. It did not circulate officially in the Soviet Union for another 30 years, but its contents leaked almost immediately, first to the Eastern European parties, then to Western intelligence services, then to the wider world. The effects of the speech rippled outward through the Eastern Bloc with the slow, uneven movement of a change in weather, felt differently in different places, but felt everywhere. In Poland and Hungary, the sense that the Stalinist model might be open to revision, that the tight constraints of the previous decade might be loosening, produced movements of political and intellectual ferment that varied in their character and their outcome. In Poland, the process resulted in the emergence of W. Ladislaw Gomulka as party leader, a man who had been imprisoned during the Stalinist period for alleged nationalist deviations, and who represented, at least in the hopeful understanding of many Poles, a more independent and less Moscow-directed form of communism. In Hungary, the process went considerably further, and its endpoint was considerably more dramatic, and its suppression was considerably more sudden and final. But even these moments of friction and adjustment were, in the longer view, episodes within a broader stability, the stability of a divided world that had accepted, or had been made to accept, its division as something close to permanent. The Iron Curtain had become, by the mid-1950s, a feature of the landscape as familiar, and as taken for granted as a mountain range or a coastline, something that had always been there, or might as well have been, something that organized the geography of the world in ways that seemed natural even when they were not. Children grew up on both sides of it knowing no other world. Teachers taught within its framework. Artists made work that was shaped, whether they acknowledged it or not, by the fact of its existence. Governments planned and budgeted and argued within the assumptions it created. The division of the world had become, in the patient and unhurried way of all large structures, the world itself. And yet within this settled and architectural solidity, there were always small movements, small stirrings, the kind of quiet activity that takes place in the walls of an old building, evidence that the structure, however solid it appears, is still alive in some sense, still subject to the slow and persistent pressure of the forces that surround it. Letters crossed the border. Radio signals moved through walls and windows, carrying news and music, and the sound of a different kind of life to people who listened with their ears close to the set, in the particular darkness of late-night rooms. Books were passed from hand to hand, their covers replaced or their titles disguised, carrying ideas that were technically forbidden, but that had a way of surviving in the spaces between official scrutiny. People fell in love across borders, or maintained friendships across borders, or simply remembered, with the quiet persistence of memory, that the person they had known before the border hardened was still somewhere on the other side of it, still living, still themselves. The architecture of the Cold War was very large and very solid and built to last, but it was not, in the end, quite as permanent as it appeared. All buildings have their pressures and their fault lines, their places where the mortar is thinner than elsewhere, where the weight is distributed unevenly, where a slow and patient force, applied over a long enough period of time, might eventually find its way through. The people who built the architecture of division in the late 1940s and the 1950s believed they were building something for the ages, something as permanent as the systems of belief and economics and governance that it was designed to protect and perpetuate. They were building carefully and with considerable skill, and what they built did last for a remarkably long time. But it was, in the end, a building subject, like all buildings, to the slow work of time, the quiet insistence of change, the gentle and relentless pressure of the world as it continues to become something new. For now, though, in the soft gray light of the 1950s, the walls stood solid and unmoved. The two halves of Europe settled into their routines, their habits, their separate ways of understanding the same world. The lights came on at dusk in apartments on both sides of the divide, and people sat at kitchen tables and read their newspapers and ate their dinners and put their children to bed, living their ordinary lives within the extraordinary framework that history had provided for them. The Cold War hummed in the background of everything, like the sound of a very distant motorway on a quiet night, always there, always present, never quite loud enough to demand attention, but shaping, in its quiet way, the texture of every waking hour. There is a quality to the light just before a storm that is unlike any other kind of light. It has a particular heaviness to it, a bruised and yellowish quality, as though the air itself has become aware of what is coming and has changed its character in anticipation. The shadows are deeper than usual. The colors of ordinary things, the green of a lawn, the red of a brick wall, the gray of a pavement, seem both more vivid and more ominous, as though they have been asked to carry more meaning than they normally bear. And then, sometimes, the storm does not come. The clouds move through and the sky lightens again, and the quality of threat dissipates slowly back into the ordinary texture of an afternoon, and you are left with the memory of that heavy light and the particular feeling it produced, the feeling of having been close to something without quite arriving at it, of having stood at the edge of a very large thing and then stepped quietly back. The Cold War had several moments of that quality, moments when the world stood at the edge of something vast and terrible and then, through some combination of caution and luck and the slow, patient work of people who understood the stakes, stepped quietly back. These moments were not dramatic in the way that actual wars are dramatic, because the drama of actual wars is the drama of things happening, of events unfolding with the irreversible momentum of physical forces set in motion. The drama of these Cold War moments was the drama of things not happening, of forces held in check, of the possible contained within the boundaries of the merely threatening. It is a quieter kind of drama, and in some ways a more interesting one, because it is the drama of human judgment operating under conditions of extreme pressure, of people deciding, in the midst of enormous complexity and incomplete information, to choose the path that leads back from the edge rather than the one that leads over it. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950 and continued for 3 years with the slow, grinding patience of a conflict that neither side could quite win, and neither side was willing to lose, was the first of the Cold War's major proxy engagements. The first of the many places around the world where the broader competition between the United States and the Soviet Union found its expression not in direct confrontation between the two powers, but in the fighting of other people's wars, in the support and supply and occasional direction of conflicts that were nominally about local or regional disputes, but that were also, always, about the larger argument. Korea had been divided after the Second World War along the 38th parallel, with a Soviet-backed government in the north and an American-backed government in the south. And in June of 1950, the Northern Army crossed that line with the steady, purposeful movement of a force that had been preparing for the crossing for some time. The American response was organized through the United Nations, which had been established after the war with the explicit purpose of providing a framework for the collective management of international security, and which was able to act in Korea partly because the Soviet Union was, at that moment, boycotting the Security Council over the question of Chinese representation, and was therefore not present to exercise its veto. The war that followed was long and costly, and ended not in victory for either side but in an armistice, a suspension of hostilities along a line very close to where the fighting had begun, a line that is still, in the present day, one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. The Korean War killed something in the region of 3 million people, of whom a large proportion were civilians, and it ended in a kind of suspended incompleteness that was, in its own way, characteristic of the Cold War's particular way of not resolving things. The years between the Korean War's armistice in 1953 and the Great Crisis of 1962 were years of gradual accumulation, of weapons, of tensions, of the slow development of a world in which the possibility of catastrophic conflict was present as a permanent background condition, like the distant sound of thunder in a season that brings many storms. Both sides built more missiles. Both sides tested more nuclear weapons, in the flat and dusty expanses of Nevada, and in the vast emptiness of the Kazakh steppe, and on the atolls of the Pacific, and in the frozen distances of Novaya Zemlya in the Soviet Arctic. Tests that sent their invisible signatures through the atmosphere, accumulating there slowly in the form of radioactive isotopes that drifted in the upper air and settled, with the unhurried patience of dust, onto the surface of the earth and into the soil, and the water and the food, and the bodies of people who had no knowledge of and no say in the decisions that had produced them. The Cuban Revolution, which brought Fidel Castro and his movement to power in January of 1959, added a new and particularly sensitive element to the already complicated geography of the Cold War. Cuba was not a distant country in an obscure corner of the world. It was an island 90 miles from the coast of Florida, visible on a clear day from the southern tip of the American peninsula, close enough that its political character had always been a matter of immediate American concern. The Eisenhower administration had greeted Castro's revolution with a wariness that gradually hardened into hostility, as it became clear that Castro intended to nationalize American-owned businesses on the island and was developing warm relations with the Soviet Union. The relationship between Washington and Havana cooled with the slow inevitability of a change in season, and by the time John Kennedy took office in January of 1961, it had reached a temperature that made normal diplomatic engagement essentially impossible. In April of 1961, a force of approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the American Central Intelligence Agency, landed on the southern coast of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs, with the intention of provoking an uprising against Castro's government. The operation was poorly planned and poorly executed, and it failed with a completeness that was, for the Kennedy administration, both politically embarrassing and strategically significant. The exiles were captured within 3 days. The uprising did not materialize. Castro's government emerged from the episode with its authority enhanced and its relationship with the Soviet Union deepened. The failed invasion had demonstrated, clearly enough, that Cuba needed Soviet support to deter future American action, and the Soviet Union was willing to provide it. The relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union deepened through the months that followed, and in the summer of 1962, the Soviet leadership, Khrushchev, specifically, with his characteristic combination of boldness and calculation, made a decision that would bring the world to the closest it has ever come, in the nuclear age, to the edge of catastrophic war. The decision was to deploy Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, medium-range ballistic missiles that, once operational, would be capable of reaching most of the major cities of the eastern United States within minutes of launch. The reasoning was a mixture of the strategic and the personal. The missiles would deter an American invasion of Cuba, would redress the strategic imbalance created by American missiles deployed in Turkey close to Soviet territory, and would demonstrate that the Soviet Union was capable of bold action in America's own backyard. The missiles began arriving in Cuba in the late summer of 1962, transported by Soviet ships moving through the warm blue water of the Atlantic with the unhurried regularity of merchant traffic. They were being installed at sites in the Cuban countryside, and the installation was proceeding with reasonable care and concealment, but not with enough care and concealment to escape the attention of American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, which flew their long, slow, solitary routes through the thin air of the upper atmosphere with their cameras running continuously, recording in precise and patient detail the landscape far below. On the 14th of October, 1962, an American U-2 photographed the missile installations clearly enough that the photographs could not be misread. The following morning, analysts in Washington were looking at images that told them, in the unambiguous language of aerial photography, that Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed in Cuba. What followed was 13 days of careful, deliberate, extraordinarily consequential decision-making. 13 days in which the world moved through that particular quality of heavy, pre-storm light, and did not quite arrive at the storm. Kennedy was informed of the missile installations on the morning of October 16th, and he immediately convened a small group of his most senior advisors, which came to be known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The group met repeatedly over the following days, in conditions of strict secrecy. The existence of the crisis was not known publicly until Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22nd, working through the options available, each of which carried its own particular weight of risk and consequence. The options ranged from doing nothing, accepting the missiles as a fait accompli, and adjusting American strategy accordingly, to conducting immediate air strikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational, to a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments, to a full-scale invasion. Each option was examined with the patient, methodical thoroughness of people who understood that they were making decisions whose consequences could not be recalled once set in motion. Decisions that, once made, would have the irreversible quality of physical forces, that would produce reactions and counter-reactions that might carry the world to places that no one on any side actually wanted to go. Kennedy chose the naval blockade, or, as it was carefully termed in the official language, the quarantine, because the word blockade carried specific legal implications under international law. American warships were positioned across the sea lanes leading to Cuba, and Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment were informed that they would be stopped and searched. The announcement of the quarantine made in Kennedy's televised address on October 22nd, was delivered in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was saying it with full awareness of its weight. The Soviet missiles in Cuba, he told the American people and the watching world, would not be tolerated. The quarantine was in effect. The United States was prepared to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full, retaliatory response. The world held in the days that followed a particular quality of stillness, the stillness not of peace but of suspension, of a breath drawn in and not yet released. Soviet ships continued on their course toward Cuba for a time, then slowed, then stopped, then turned back. The moment at which the Soviet ships turned, somewhere in the warm Atlantic, on a morning that was presumably like other mornings except that it was not, was described afterward by the American Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, in a phrase that has stayed in the language because it captures something essential about the experience of that moment. "We're eyeball to eyeball," he said, and I think the other fellow just blinked. The phrase is vivid and somewhat dramatic, but what it describes was not dramatic in its physical reality. It was simply ships turning around on a large ocean, leaving behind them a trail of wake that gradually flattened and disappeared into the surface of the water. The negotiations that resolved the crisis proceeded over the following days through a combination of official diplomatic channels and unofficial back-channel communications, including a series of letters exchanged directly between Kennedy and Khrushchev that had, in their language, a quality of directness, and even of mutual recognition, that was somewhat unusual in the formal discourse of Cold War diplomacy. Khrushchev's letters, in particular, had a warmth and an urgency, a sense of a man who understood the gravity of the situation and was looking for a way out that would allow both sides to step back from the edge without humiliation. The agreement that was eventually reached involved the Soviet Union withdrawing its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba, and in a provision that was kept secret for many years, the eventual removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it settled into history and memory, became the defining example of the Cold War's essential tension. The tension between the enormous destructive power that both sides possessed and the equally enormous caution that both sides, for the most part, exercised in managing that power. The crisis had been closer than most people knew. American destroyers had dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine, carrying a nuclear torpedo whose commander had, at one point, believed his country was already at war and had needed to be talked back from the decision to fire by his second-in-command. The world had not been in the calm control of its leaders throughout those 13 days. It had been, in part, in the hands of individuals in positions of extreme stress making decisions, with incomplete information in the dark and cold and pressure of the ocean depths. And the fact that it had come out as it did owed something to judgment, and something to caution, and something to the plain, quiet luck of the world. The years that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis were years of a particular kind of sobered awareness, a period in which both sides seemed, at least in some of their institutional behaviors, to have absorbed the lesson that the crisis had offered about the risks of miscalculation and the value of communication. A direct telephone line, the famous hotline, though it was in fact a teletype line rather than a telephone in its original form, was established between Washington and Moscow in 1963, allowing the leaders of the two countries to communicate directly in moments of crisis, without the delays and misunderstandings that could arise from normal diplomatic channels. The line was painted red in the popular imagination, which gave it a vividness and a symbolism that the actual teletype machine, sitting quietly in an office in the Pentagon, somewhat lacked. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater, though not underground, was the first significant arms control agreement of the Cold War, and it arrived with the quiet relief of people who have been breathing a particular kind of air for a long time and have finally been given reason to believe that the air might improve. The treaty did not stop nuclear testing entirely, and it did not reduce the number of nuclear weapons in existence, and it did not resolve any of the fundamental tensions of the Cold War. But it demonstrated that the two sides could reach an agreement on a matter of genuine importance, that the conversation was possible, that the wall of mutual suspicion was not entirely without its doors. The Vietnam War, which escalated through the 1960s with the slow, persistent momentum of a situation that no one quite intended, but that no one knew how to stop, was in many ways the Korean War's darker and more complicated successor. Another proxy conflict in which the broader Cold War logic played out in the specific geography and politics of a country, far from the main arena of superpower competition. The American involvement in Vietnam grew gradually, through the early 1960s, from a small number of military advisors to a large-scale combat deployment that reached, at its peak in 1968, something close to 500,000 American soldiers. The war was fought in the heat and the green density of a landscape that was utterly unlike the landscapes of American experience, in the paddies and jungles and hill country of a country whose history and culture were deeply unfamiliar to most of the young Americans who found themselves walking its paths. The logic of American involvement in Vietnam was the logic of containment, the belief, developed in the Truman years and never entirely abandoned, that the spread of communism anywhere in the world was a matter of American strategic concern, that the fall of one country to communist governance would create conditions that made the fall of neighboring countries more likely, in the manner of dominoes arranged in a line. The domino theory, as it was called, had a certain schematic clarity that made it appealing as a framework for decision-making, but it did not quite capture the complexity of what was actually happening in Vietnam, which was not simply a Cold War proxy conflict, but also a civil war and a nationalist revolution, and a struggle with deep roots in Vietnamese history that predated the Cold War by a very long time. The North Vietnamese government, led by Ho Chi Minh, was communist in its ideology and supported by the Soviet Union and China in its military effort. But it was also, and this was the part of the equation that American strategy persistently underweighted, a nationalist movement with genuine popular support among large portions of the Vietnamese population, support that drew on decades of resistance to foreign domination, first French and then American. The Viet Cong, the southern guerrilla forces that fought alongside the North Vietnamese regular army, were not simply instruments of an external communist project, but people with their own reasons, their own histories, their own understanding of what they were fighting for. The war they fought was patient and dispersed and deeply embedded in the landscape and the social fabric of the countryside, and it proved extraordinarily resistant to the kind of conventional military power that the United States deployed against it. The war in Vietnam produced, in the United States, a fracturing of the domestic consensus that had broadly supported Cold War policy since its beginnings in the late 1940s. The fracturing was slow, and then faster, and then very fast, a process that began with quiet academic skepticism about the justifications for the war and ended with mass demonstrations in the streets of American cities, with young men burning their draft cards in the soft autumn air of campus quadrangles, with the persistent and deepening sense that the country had committed itself to something that it could not win and should not have entered. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, in which North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive and coordinated series of attacks across South Vietnam, including attacks on the grounds of the American Embassy in Saigon, did not constitute a military victory for the North. The attacks were ultimately repelled, but it demonstrated, with a clarity that penetrated even the most optimistic official assessments, that the war was far from the favorable course that had been described to the American public. The year 1968 had a quality throughout the world of accumulated pressure, finding its outlets, not just in Vietnam but in Czechoslovakia, where the Prague Spring brought a period of political liberalization under Alexander Dubček that seemed, for a few months of that extraordinary year, to suggest that a different kind of socialism might be possible, a socialism with a human face, as Dubček put it. The Soviet response to the Prague Spring came in August, when Warsaw-packed tanks moved into Czechoslovakia with the slow, heavy inevitability of a door closing, and the experiment ended, and the country settled back into a gray and somewhat exhausted compliance that would last for another 20 years. The Brezhnev Doctrine, as the Soviet position was formalized, the assertion that the Soviet Union reserved the right to intervene in any socialist country where socialism itself was threatened, was not a new idea dressed in new language, but it was stated with a directness that made its implications impossible to misread. The period that followed, the early 1970s, under the Nixon administration in the United States and under Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, brought something new into the vocabulary of Cold War diplomacy. Détente, a French word meaning a relaxation of tension, the kind of word that describes the feeling of a knot loosening slowly in a rope that has been under strain for a long time. Détente was not peace, and it was not trust, and it was not the resolution of the fundamental differences between the two systems. It was something more modest and more practical, a mutual recognition that the competition between the two powers could be managed in ways that reduced the risk of catastrophic miscalculation, that agreements were possible on specific matters of shared interest, that the conversation, however complicated and however guarded, was preferable to silence. The strategic arms limitation talks, SALT, as they were known, produced agreements in 1972 that placed limits on the numbers of certain categories of nuclear weapons that each side could deploy, not reducing the arsenals that already existed, but at least establishing a framework within which the upward spiral of accumulation might be slowed. Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972, the first visit by an American president to the Soviet capital, had the quality of a very formal, very careful diplomatic ceremony, two men meeting across a table in an ornate room, shaking hands for the cameras with the measured deliberateness of people who understand the symbolic weight of every gesture. The same year, Nixon visited China, reopening a relationship that had been frozen since the Communist Revolution of 1949, in a diplomatic move of considerable strategic intelligence that altered the geometry of the Cold War in ways that would continue to develop for decades. The shadows at the edge of war fell differently in the years of détente than they had in the years of maximum tension, less sharply defined, less immediately threatening but still present, still cast by the same enormous objects that had always produced them. The nuclear arsenals were still there. The missiles were still in their silos. The submarines were still moving through the dark water. The competition had not ended. It had found a somewhat more manageable form. And the world, which had grown accustomed to living in the shadow of things that might happen and had not quite happened, continued its patient, unhurried turning through the seasons, carrying within it, as it had always carried, the full weight of everything that human beings were capable of, both the terrible and the careful, both the destructive and the steadying, both the shadow and the light that cast it. There is a particular quality to the end of winter that is easy to miss if you are not paying close attention. It does not arrive all at once, and it does not announce itself with any single clear gesture. Instead, it comes gradually, in the way that all truly large changes come, through the slow accumulation of small signs, each one individually almost too subtle to notice, but adding up over days and weeks to something unmistakable. A morning arrives that is a degree or two warmer than the mornings before it. The light lasts a little longer in the evening. A patch of snow on a north-facing slope thins imperceptibly, its edges retreating by fractions, its surface losing the hard, crystalline quality of deep winter, and acquiring instead a softer, more yielding texture. The ice on a river begins to shift, almost inaudibly, with the gentle sound of something that has been held in place for a long time beginning, very slowly, to move. And then one day, without quite knowing when the change happened, you find yourself standing in a world that is no longer winter, and you try to remember the exact moment of transition, and find that there was no exact moment, only the long, patient process of thawing, steady and unhurried and ultimately irresistible. The end of the Cold War arrived in something like that manner. It was not declared. There was no single document signed in a formal room, no ceremony at which the conflict was officially concluded, no moment at which someone turned to someone else and said, "It is over now, you may rest." Instead, it came through the slow accumulation of changes, through the patient working of forces that had been building for years before they became visible, through the gradual and then accelerating erosion of a structure that had seemed, for decades, too large and too solid to be moved by anything less than catastrophe. And yet it moved, and yet it ended. And the ending, when it came, had the quality not of an explosion but of a slow exhalation, the long, tired, relieved breath of a world that had been holding itself in readiness for a very long time and was finally, cautiously, allowing itself to relax. The 1970s were, in many ways, years of quiet exhaustion on both sides of the Cold War divide. The United States was absorbing the long and complicated aftermath of Vietnam, the particular heaviness of a conflict that had ended not in victory or in clear defeat, but in a kind of prolonged, painful withdrawal, a slow disentanglement from something that had consumed enormous resources and enormous lives, and had altered, in ways that were still being understood, the country's sense of itself and its place in the world. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam came home to a country that was not entirely sure how to receive them, that was tired of the war in ways that sometimes made it tired of the people who had fought it, and they settled back into American life with a quietness that had its own complicated weight, carrying their experiences in ways that were not always visible from the outside. The Soviet Union in the same years was entering a period that Soviet citizens would later refer to, with a mixture of irony and nostalgia, as the era of stagnation. A long, gray, somewhat becalmed period under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, who had come to power in 1964 and who would remain in power until his death in 1982, aging slowly and visibly through the latter years of his tenure, his public appearances becoming increasingly brief and increasingly effortful. His face acquiring the heavy, settled quality of a man who has been in one position for a very long time and has no particular intention of moving. The Soviet economy was growing, but slowly, and with a decreasing efficiency that the system's central planners were finding harder and harder to manage. The oil revenues that had cushioned the Soviet budget through much of the 1970s. The Soviet Union was a major oil producer, and the oil price shocks of that decade had, counterintuitively, benefited it considerably, masked the underlying structural problems, but did not resolve them. The invasion of Afghanistan, which the Soviet Union undertook in December of 1979, was the kind of decision that looks, in retrospect, like a step taken in a direction from which there was no comfortable return. A commitment made with the calm confidence of people who expected a short, manageable engagement, and who found themselves instead in the slow, patient, wearing embrace of a conflict that had no clear ending and no easy resolution. Soviet forces moved into Afghanistan with the deliberate, organized quality of a military operation that had been carefully planned, and they encountered, in the mountains and valleys and dry riverbeds of that ancient and difficult country, a resistance that was dispersed and persistent and deeply rooted in a landscape that had always been unkind to the armies of outside powers. The Mujahideen, as the Afghan resistance fighters were known, received support from the United States, from Pakistan, from Saudi Arabia, weapons and money flowing through back channels with the quiet persistence of water finding its way through rock. And they fought the Soviet occupation with a patience that outlasted Soviet calculations about how long the resistance could be sustained. Afghanistan became, for the Soviet Union, something of what Vietnam had been for the United States, a conflict that drained resources and morale without producing the clear and manageable outcome that had been anticipated, a conflict that raised questions about the limits of military power when applied to problems that were not primarily military in their nature. Soviet soldiers served their rotations in the heat and dust and cold of Afghan winters, and came home carrying their own complications, and the war continued regardless, in the way that such wars continue, with its own momentum and its own demands. The Soviet military and political leadership had not anticipated this, and the not anticipating of it was, in its own quiet way, a sign of something, a sign that the system's capacity to understand the world it was operating in was perhaps not as reliable as it had been assumed to be. The man who would change everything arrived at the leadership of the Soviet Union in March of 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev was selected by the Politburo as General Secretary of the Communist Party, the top position in the Soviet system, the position from which all significant decisions ultimately flowed. Gorbachev was, by the standards of Soviet leadership, strikingly young. He was 54 years old when he took power, at a time when his three immediate predecessors had each died in office after brief tenures marked by visible physical decline. He was also, by those same standards, strikingly energetic and strikingly willing to say things that had not previously been said aloud in official Soviet discourse. Things about the problems in the Soviet economy, about the need for transparency in Soviet governance, about the costs of the arms race, and the burden of maintaining an empire that extended far beyond the Soviet Union's own borders. Gorbachev had grown up in the Soviet system and believed, genuinely and deeply, in the possibility of socialism as a form of human organization. But he believed that the socialism actually existing in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s was a damaged and diminished version of what it might be, encrusted with decades of bureaucratic inertia and political dishonesty, and a systematic avoidance of the truth about how things actually stood. His two great reform programs, glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, were intended to address this condition. Glasnost by allowing a greater degree of honest public discussion about Soviet realities, perestroika by reforming the economic and political institutions that had produced those realities. He did not intend, by these reforms, to end the Soviet Union. He intended to save it, to make it more honest and more efficient and more capable of competing in a world that had changed substantially since the structures of the Soviet state had been put in place. The effects of glasnost were, in some ways, the most immediately visible and the most immediately consequential of the two programs. When the space for honest public discussion widens, even slightly, things flow into it that have been waiting a very long time for exactly that space, truths that have been suppressed, grievances that have been unacknowledged, histories that have been falsified or simply ignored. Soviet citizens, given the opportunity to speak more openly than they had been permitted to speak before, began to speak, with the gradual gathering confidence of people who are discovering that the thing they feared might happen if they said certain things is not, in fact, happening. Newspapers began to publish accounts of problems that had previously been invisible in print. Television programs began to discuss subjects that had previously been off limits. The past, the Stalin years, the purges, the Gulag, the falsifications and the crimes and the immense accumulated dishonesty of decades of official history, began to be discussed, carefully at first and then with increasing directness, in a public conversation that was both necessary and, once begun, very difficult to manage or contain. The relationship between Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, who had been the American president since 1981, was one of the more unlikely and more consequential relationships of the Cold War's final years. Reagan had come to office with a rhetorical posture toward the Soviet Union that was among the most confrontational of the post-war era. He had described the Soviet Union, in a 1983 speech to a gathering of evangelical Christians, as an evil empire, a phrase that landed with a particular weight in the political discourse of both countries. He had also launched a significant expansion of American military spending, including the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars, a proposed system of space-based missile defenses that was, depending on one's assessment of its technical feasibility, either a genuine strategic program or an enormously expensive bluff. But that worried the Soviet leadership in either case. Because if it worked, it would neutralize the Soviet nuclear deterrent and shift the strategic balance decisively. And yet Reagan, beneath the confrontational rhetoric, was also a man who had a genuine and somewhat personal fear of nuclear war, a fear that was not political calculation but something more immediate, a visceral awareness of what the weapons actually meant, of the world they would produce if they were ever used. He had seen briefings on the effects of nuclear war, and the briefings had left marks on him that were not erasable by the logic of deterrence or the abstractions of strategic theory. When Gorbachev came to power and began sending signals that the Soviet Union was interested in genuine arms reduction, not the careful, incremental management of the previous SALT agreements, but actual reductions in the numbers of weapons, Reagan was, perhaps more than many of his advisers expected, genuinely receptive. The meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev had a quality that was somewhat unprecedented in the history of Cold War summitry, a quality of personal engagement, of two men actually talking to each other rather than simply delivering prepared positions across a formal table. The summit at Geneva in November 1985 produced no specific agreements, but produced something perhaps more durable, a mutual recognition between the two leaders that the other was a serious person, with whom genuine conversation was possible. The summit at Reykjavik, Iceland, in October 1986 was something stranger and more remarkable, a meeting at which the two leaders came very close, in the course of 2 days of intense and largely improvised discussion, to agreeing to eliminate all nuclear weapons, a proposal so sweeping that it alarmed the advisers and allies of both men and ultimately foundered on the question of Reagan's attachment to the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Gorbachev insisted must be constrained as part of any comprehensive deal. The meeting ended without agreement, and yet it had demonstrated something important, that the conversation had reached a depth and a seriousness that had not previously been achieved. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in Washington in December 1987, was the agreement that the Reykjavik conversation had eventually, after another year of negotiation, produced, not the elimination of all nuclear weapons, which remained beyond reach, but the elimination of an entire category of nuclear weapons. The land-based intermediate-range missiles that had been deployed in Europe, and that had, for years, been among the most contentious elements of the nuclear confrontation. The treaty required the destruction of more than 2,500 missiles, and it included verification provisions, on-site inspections, the exchange of data that would have been essentially unimaginable in the Cold War's earlier decades. It was, in its way, a remarkable document, evidence that the long, slow thaw was producing real changes in the structure of the competition, not just in its rhetoric. While the superpower relationship was gradually warming, the internal pressures within the Soviet bloc were building with a slow and patient persistence that would ultimately prove more transformative than any diplomatic agreement. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union movement, which had emerged in 1980 from strikes at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk under the leadership of an electrician named Lech Walesa, had been suppressed by the imposition of martial law in 1981, but had continued to exist underground, maintaining its networks and its sense of purpose through the gray years of the mid-1980s, with the quiet determination of something that has learned to survive in difficult conditions. By 1988 and 1989, as Gorbachev signals that the Soviet Union would not intervene militarily to preserve communist governments in Eastern Europe, became increasingly clear, solidarity re-emerged into public life with the unhurried confidence of an organization that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The negotiations between the Polish Communist government and Solidarity, conducted at a large round table in Warsaw in the early months of 1989, produced an agreement for partially free elections. Elections in which Solidarity would be allowed to compete for a portion of the seats in a newly reconstituted parliament. The elections, held in June of 1989, produced a result that was, even by the most optimistic assessments, startling in its completeness. Solidarity won virtually every contested seat, with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about where the Polish people stood on the question of their government. The Communist Party, which had governed Poland for 4 decades, found itself in a position from which there was no comfortable recovery, and by August, a Solidarity-led government had taken office, the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc since the late 1940s, arrived at not through violence or invasion, but through the slow, patient, ultimately irresistible pressure of a people expressing their preferences through the available channels. The change in Poland was, as it turned out, the first stone in what would become, through the autumn of 1989, one of the most remarkable sequences of political transformation in modern history. In Hungary, the communist government had been quietly liberalizing for months, and in May it had begun dismantling the fortified fence along its border with Austria, a practical and symbolic act of considerable significance, since the fence was part of the Iron Curtain, and its removal created an opening through which East Germans, vacationing in Hungary in large numbers, began to cross into Austria and thence to West Germany. The flow of East German refugees through Hungary grew through the summer into something that could no longer be managed by normal means, and the pressure it represented, the pressure of people voting with their feet, choosing, at personal risk, and with personal determination, to leave, was added to the pressure building within East Germany itself, where large and peaceful demonstrations were gathering in Leipzig and Dresden and other cities, the participants walking through autumn streets with candles, in a silence that was more powerful than any speech. The East German government, led by Erich Honecker, and then, after Honecker's removal in October, by a succession of increasingly desperate officials trying to manage a situation that had passed beyond management, made its final decision on the evening of November 9th, 1989, in circumstances that were, characteristically, somewhat confused. A party spokesman named Günter Schabowski, at a press conference that was being broadcast live, read out a new regulation about travel permissions, and when asked when it would come into effect, consulted his notes and said, "Immediately, without delay." He had not been fully briefed. The regulation had not yet been implemented. But the words had been spoken on live television, and within hours East Berliners had gathered at the checkpoints in the wall that divided their city, and the guards, receiving no clear orders and facing crowds too large and too calm and too certain of their purpose to be turned away by any reasonable means, opened the gates. The images of that night, people climbing onto the wall, people embracing on both sides of it, the sound of hammers and chisels beginning the slow work of breaking it apart, the faces of people who had grown up in a divided city discovering, in the space of a few hours, that the division was over. Those images have a quality that is difficult to describe without resorting to words that are perhaps too large, too weighted, too far from the register of the quiet and the ordinary. And yet the night itself, for many of the people who were there, had a quality not of drama, but of something gentler, a quality of disbelief gradually giving way to wonder, of tears that were not sorrowful, of laughter that was not quite sure of itself yet, of the particular feeling of a thing that has been wished for so long that its arrival seems almost impossible to fully trust. The wall came down in pieces and in stages, not all at once. The physical dismantling took months, and the dismantling of the habits and the structures and the divided ways of thinking that the wall had enforced for nearly 3 decades, took considerably longer. Germany was formally reunified on the 3rd of October, 1990, in a ceremony of considerable formality and somewhat complicated emotion. The joy of reunion mixed with the practical and psychological weight of merging two societies that had spent 40 years becoming, in many respects, quite different from each other. The reunification was negotiated with the patient attention to detail that such a process required, and it was accomplished in the end with a thoroughness and a relative peacefulness that had not been guaranteed and was not taken for granted. The Soviet Union itself was, by this point, in a condition of advanced and accelerating change. Gorbachev's reforms had set in motion forces that he had hoped to direct, but was finding increasingly difficult to manage forces of nationalist assertion in the Soviet republics, forces of economic discontent produced by a reform process that had disrupted the old order without yet establishing a new one, forces of political opening that had allowed voices to emerge that had not previously been heard, and that were saying things more radical than the reformers had anticipated. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which had been incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940 in the shadow of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, were moving steadily toward independence, their parliaments passing declarations of sovereignty, and then, in the Lithuanian case, an outright declaration of independence in March of 1990. The Soviet response was halting and uncertain, as though the system was not quite sure, in this new situation, what its own rules were. The attempted coup of August 1991, the effort by a group of conservative Communist Party officials and military figures to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and reassert the old order, failed within 3 days, not with a dramatic defeat, but with a quiet and somewhat embarrassed dissolution, the conspirators retreating in the face of crowds in Moscow who gathered around the Russian parliament building and simply declined to move. Standing there in the warm August air with a patience and a resolution that the coup's planners had not anticipated and could not overcome, Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president, stood on a tank outside the parliament and declared his opposition to the coup in a gesture that was both practically and symbolically decisive. The coup collapsed. Gorbachev returned from the Crimea, where he had been held under house arrest, but returned to a changed situation, one in which the authority of the Communist Party and of the Soviet central government had been fatally and visibly undermined. The Soviet Union dissolved itself on the 25th of December, 1991, in a process that was, considering the scale of what was happening, remarkably undramatic. Gorbachev resigned. The red flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time in the dark of a December evening, and the Russian tricolor was raised in its place. 15 independent states emerged from the dissolution of the Union, each one beginning the long and complicated process of understanding what it was now, what its history meant, what kind of future it could build from the inheritance the Soviet period had left it. The process was not uniformly peaceful. In some of the new states, the dissolution of the old order produced conflicts that were sharp and painful and lasting. But the central fact of the dissolution itself, the ending of the world's largest communist state without a world war, without a nuclear exchange, without the catastrophe that had always lurked as a possibility in the deep background of Cold War calculations, was something that deserved and received a moment of quiet and profound recognition. The Cold War had lasted, from its gradual beginning in the late 1940s to its gradual ending in the early 1990s, approximately 4 decades, a span of time sufficient to encompass the entire adult lives of many of the people who lived through it, sufficient to shape the political institutions and physical landscapes and cultural habits of virtually every country on Earth. It had cost enormous amounts of money, enormous amounts of human effort, and, in the proxy wars that were its most violent expressions, enormous numbers of human lives. It had produced a permanent revolution in the technology of weapons and of space exploration. It had organized the politics of dozens of countries into alignments that persisted long after the original logic of those alignments had shifted or dissolved. It had shaped the way 2 generations of human beings understood their world and their place within it. And then it was over, and the world had to find a new way of understanding itself, had to locate, in the unfamiliar quiet of a world no longer organized around that central defining competition, the shape of what came next. The process was slow, and it was complicated, and it was not without its own difficulties and its own new tensions. The world that emerged from the Cold War was not the simple, harmonious, conflict-free world that some had briefly hoped for in the optimistic years immediately following 1989. History had not ended, as one famous essay suggested it might. The old divisions had dissolved, but new ones were forming with the slow patience of all large formations, and the world was becoming, as it always becomes, something new and somewhat unfamiliar, carrying within it the traces of everything it had been before. But in those first quiet years of the 1990s, in the particular stillness that followed the long tension of the Cold War, there was something that resembled relief, a widespread, diffuse, somewhat tentative sense that a chapter had closed, that the particular weight of living under the shadow of potential catastrophe had been, at least in part, lifted. The missiles were still there, in their silos and their submarines. The weapons had not disappeared. The world was not without its dangers and its conflicts, and its persistent human capacity for violence, and for the construction of new enmities to replace old ones. But the specific, enormous, decades-long competition that had organized so much of the world's energy and anxiety had reached its end. And the reaching of that end had happened not through the catastrophe that had always been its most feared possible conclusion, but through the slow, patient, ultimately irresistible process of change, through the thawing of a freeze that had held for 40 years, through the gradual and then rapid dissolution of structures that had seemed permanent but were not, through the quiet insistence of people on both sides of the old divide that they wished to live differently than the Cold War had required them to live. The walls came down, the checkpoints opened, the flags changed above the buildings. And the world, as it always does, continued its patient turning, carrying forward everything that had happened, absorbing it slowly into the long, unhurried sediment of history, the way a river absorbs the stones that fall into it, smoothing their edges gradually, incorporating them into its bed, moving on through the landscape with the same steady, ancient, irresistible flow that it has always had and will always have. Long after the particular dramas of any given century have settled into silence and become, at last, the quiet ground beneath the feet of whatever comes next. The Cold War is over now, And the world it made is still, in many ways, the world we inhabit, its institutions, its weapons, its borders, its habits of thought, its way of understanding the relationship between East and West, between one system of values and another. We carry it with us, the way you carry a long journey and the way you hold your body after you have arrived, a little tired, a little different, marked by the distance and the weather of the road. The stars are the same stars. The sky is the same sky, and the world rests now in its imperfect and complicated peace, in the long, soft, gradually warming aftermath of the cold.